Welcome to POTUS 2016, where we call the presidential horse race and pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. A sad and frightening week. More terror. In Brussels, explosions rocked the airport and a subway station, killing at least 31 people, wounding hundreds more. ISIS claimed responsibility. The reaction on the campaign trail here was swift. Donald Trump renewed his call for using torture and a moratorium on Muslim immigration. Hillary Clinton called torture ineffective and insisted that fear should not dictate our foreign policy. Ted Cruz called for police infiltrating Muslim neighborhoods in the U.S. Bernie Sanders said such barbarism cannot be allowed to continue. The terror attack came just hours before President Obama's historic speech in Cuba calling for democracy on the island. The president did not shy away from calling attention to the U.S.'s flawed democracy, including this year's contentious campaign. In fact, he argued 2016 is a lesson for Cuba. Democracy isn't always pretty.
But just stop and consider this fact about the American campaign that's taking place right now. You had two Cuban Americans in the Republican Party running against the legacy of a black man who was president, while arguing that they're the best person to beat the Democratic nominee, who will either be a woman or a Democratic socialist. Who would have believed that back in 1959? That's a measure of our progress as a democracy.
No mention there of the alpha male, but Donald Trump did get his usual lion's share of attention this week when he predicted riots at the GOP convention if he were to arrive with a lead in delegates but shy of a majority and is denied the nomination.
If we're 20 votes short, or if we're 100 short, and we're at 1,100 and somebody else is at 500 or 400, because we're way ahead of everybody, I don't think you can say that we don't get it automatically. I think you'd have riots. I'm representing a tremendous, many millions of people.
2016 wouldn't be the first political convention to get out of hand. In a few minutes, we'll look at past contested conventions that got raucous. But first, to the turf. Yes, time for the horse race. Both parties rode west on Tuesday, with huge numbers turning out to the polls in Arizona, Utah, and Idaho. The results did much to confirm the strengths and weaknesses of the front-running candidates. On the Democratic side, Clinton's win in Arizona showcased a consistent appeal among non-white voters. But her 80-20 landslide losses to Sanders in both Idaho and Utah underscored Clinton's vulnerability among white Democrats. Clinton now leads Sanders by 744 delegates, including 400 superdelegates who could still switch sides. For Sanders, several predominantly white states on the primary horizon could add to his current 937 total. But he is still a long way from the 1,446 more delegates it would take to secure him the nomination. On the GOP side, Donald Trump's strengths and weaknesses were also in high relief. In Arizona, a border state, Trump's appeal among the many Republicans concerned about immigration helped him win all 58 delegates. But as expected, Trump wasn't triumphant in Utah's caucus, where Ted Cruz took home all of the largely Mormon state's 40 delegates. Mainstream conservative Republicans once again voiced their dissatisfaction with Trump, and they remain an obstacle for him in a general election. Fortunately for Trump, until then, there won't be any more Republican caucuses, which tend to attract those pesky traditional Republicans. Kasich won no delegates on Tuesday, but could still end up a spoiler for Trump or Cruz. Trump now leads that delegate race with 739, about 60% of those needed to secure the nomination. Cruz currently lags Trump with 465 delegates. Kasich has just 143. Just 944 Republican delegates remain in what continues to be a nail-biter, at least until June 7th, when California's 172 delegates are up for grabs. A deadlock convention is still possible. What would that look like? Time for some historical context. The current GOP battles first bring to mind the 1924 convention in New York, when the Democrats not only came apart over a nominee, but over whether religious and racial bigotry would be rejected or embraced by the party. Ring a bell? One of the contenders, William McAdoo, was backed by the KKK. His opponent, New York Governor Al Smith, was Catholic and against prohibition. Fistfights broke out. Roosters were released in the galleries. The July convention lasted 16 days with 103 consecutive ballots. With no air conditioning in Madison Square Garden, it was dubbed the Klan Bake. This brief film clip from the FDR Library gives a little taste.
And then the great political battle of 1924. There never was a political convention to match the Democratic National Gathering of 1924 in New York for drama and color and bitterness. McAdoo against Al Smith. Day after day of fruitless balloting. Terrific storms of passion shaking the delegates and convulsing the thousands in the gallery.
Some of the newspaper headlines from 1924 painted a fuller portrait of the raucous convention. Exhausted delegates and spectators running out of strength and hotel money, tension over the highly uncertain outcome, and a KKK demonstration. Donald Trump could have actually seen a messy demonstration in New Jersey filled with hate. What are the parallels between 2016 and 1924 and to the other rowdy conventions like 1912 and 1968? Joining us, historian Terry Galway, senior editor at Politico New York. He's the author of the book, Machine Made, Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics. Welcome to the program.
It's great to be here.
Can you go into a little more detail about the issues that took the Democrats apart in 24?
Well, I mean, you said it precisely right. It was race and it was also culture. I mean, prohibition was, on the face of it, just about drink and drunkenness, but it was really about immigration. Alcohol and alcohol consumption was thought to be, a sin of Germans and Irish and all of these others who were living in cities like New York and Boston, Chicago. And of course, there were racial issues as well. But I think it was predominantly, about religion and immigration.
Religion and immigration. And what about the KKK? Since we mentioned it in the intro, we think of them as a Southern group. What role did they play in this presidential nominating convention in New York? Well,
they were one of the largest, if not the largest caucus. It's hard to know because some of them didn't exactly advertise the fact that they were in the Klan. But based on everything I've read and seen, the Klan had penetrated the Indiana caucus, for example, and others in the North as well. And it was not really about race because by that point, the Klan had pretty much disenfranchised blacks in the South. But what the Klan did see in the North was the rise of politicians like Al Smith, like Curley in Boston, and others who were Catholic, who were ethnic, who supported prohibition and immigration. And, they were to be crushed.
And who rejected the Klan explicitly.
One of the interesting issues about the 1924 convention is that there actually was a plank on the floor, part of the platform, which condemned the Klan by name. It failed by a single vote.
It failed?
Yes. And Smith and Franklin Roosevelt, who was Smith's campaign manager, disagreed about this. Roosevelt felt that the plank should just be passed without naming the Klan, because that was the compromise, that the plank would condemn hate groups. And Roosevelt said, this is something we can all agree on. But Smith, I think, to his credit, said, no, the time has come to call out the Klan in this party for what it is. And that was tremendously divisive.
So after 100+ ballots, who won?
Nobody. John Davis was the compromise candidate. He was a lawyer in New York. McAdoo, who was the Klan's candidate, and Al Smith didn't have enough votes. It was pretty clear that they would never get enough votes. So exhausted, they came together and supported this sort of non-entity, frankly, with all due respect to his, I'm sure, brilliant career, but not someone who was not very well known, and he was promptly crushed by Calvin Coolidge.
Calvin Coolidge, the Republican in 1924.
Right.
Didn't Davis go on to be the lawyer who lost Brown versus Board of Education, representing the segregationist side in 1964?
That's
54?
Correct. Yes, that's right, 30 years later.
Amazing. 1912, can we go back even further?
Sure.
That convention is being brought up from time to time in the media now as a parallel to what the Republicans may face.
Right. And it was the Republicans, actually both conventions in 1912 were pretty raucous. The Democrats finally agreed on Woodrow Wilson after 40-something ballots, but the real drama was in the Republican Party. Teddy Roosevelt, who's now coming back, he had been president, he was not happy with his protege, the incumbent William Howard Taft. There were only 12 primaries in 1912, and Teddy Roosevelt won 8 of them. He came in with something like 250 delegates that he had won in the primaries. Taft had maybe 80. But in the ensuing backroom politics, the smoke-filled rooms in the caucuses, Taft wound up, it was clear that Taft was going to win the nomination, and Teddy Roosevelt and his supporters withdrew from the Republican convention and went and formed their own party, the Bull Moose Party, the Progressive Party.
And some people speculate there may be a third party formed out of the Republicans if Trump is the nominee this year.
It certainly is possible because the emotions are running so high and tensions are unlike anything we've seen in quite some time.
Was there violence in 1912, violence in 1924?
Well, there was violence in 1924 for sure. Not so much, I mean, as raucous as those conventions were in 12, we didn't see fistfights. But the convention of 24 and the general election of 1928, which I would argue is one of the ugliest and perhaps even the ugliest election we've ever had, including 1800, which is the one historians always like to talk about.
Al Smith went on to be the nominee in 28,
Correct.
lost to Herbert Hoover.
Correct. He was the first non-Protestant ever to win the nomination. When he gave speeches in the South, there were crosses burned in the distance. And the things that were said about Al Smith and Al Smith's wife were just atrocious. I mean, the sort of thing that would even shock us today.
No nude spreads, though.
No, I have to check, but as far as I know, no.
1968. People living today, if they're old enough, will remember that one. There were riots in the streets at the Democratic Convention, or I should say outside the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
Well, things got pretty rough on the floor, too, as Dan Rather could still tell you. I mean, Dan Rather was basically thrown to the ground while reporting by the Chicago police. But yes, that was probably the most recent raucous convention. And in that convention, Hubert Humphrey came into it not having competed in a single primary. Now, of course, 68 sort of gets an asterisk because the assassination of Robert Kennedy sort of made, I mean, obviously a terrible tragedy, but also made a mess.
Just after he won the California primary.
June 6th, right. And so there was a real floor fight. Which the vice president, Hubert Humphrey, won. That was considered to be a defeat for the anti-war candidates because, after all, Humphrey was Lyndon Johnson's vice president. Lyndon Johnson couldn't run for president that year because he felt he would be rejected because of the Vietnam War.
So we haven't had one of these in a long time.
Yes, a long time.
Is it because the political parties have changed the rules to avoid contested conventions?
Yes, and also I mean, in my own lifetime, we have seen, which is longer than I'd admit, we've seen this tremendous growth of primaries. So that you're taking, this was considered a small d democratic reform. Take the process out of the back room, away from the bosses, and let the party members decide who their candidate should be. And it's worked rather neatly. I mean, the closest we've come to a contested convention was in 1976, the Republicans, with Ronald Reagan challenging and then ultimately losing to the fairly weak incumbent Gerald Ford.
And so we're seeing the results of that in perhaps the most contentious way possible this year, where I think more than in any other case, since the primaries became so primary, where the electorate in one party is not in sync with the party leaders. So Trump may wind up with a majority or close to a majority of the delegates by the time they get to the convention, much to the chagrin of the leaders of the Republican Party.
Right, and you know, we actually saw that in 1976 in the Democratic side as well, where Jimmy Carter, a one-time 2-year governor of Georgia, who many Democrats in the establishment had never met, had never heard of. And he came from nowhere, you know, riding a populist outrage against Watergate, against the Nixon administration, wins the nomination. And it was as a result of Carter's upset victory in '76 that we see the beginnings of the superdelegate system, where the Democratic establishment tried to ensure that something like this never happened again.
Because those 400 or so superdelegates this year, almost all of whom are pledged to Hillary Clinton, really represent the party establishment.
Yes.
Of course, we should point out that in 2008, most of them started out for Hillary Clinton, and when it became clear that Obama was winning the majority of elected delegates, many of them flipped.
That's right.
So they were somewhat responsive to, populist primary elected delegates' passions.
Right. But, I think the larger point here is that while obviously members of political parties have a right to choose their nominee, at the end of the day, it is the party, it is this sort of institution, it's this club that winds up deciding who should best represent them. And I think that while that sounds sort of very old-fashioned and reeks of bosses, I think we may discover the virtues of bosses this summer.
So what options would the Republican bosses have? Unlike the Democrats, they don't have a lot of superdelegates. There is no superdelegate structure in the Republican Party to call on and flip it from one side to the other. What would their options be if Trump is just shy of an elected delegate majority or just over it?
Well, the hard part is if he's just over it. I think what you can try to do is flip delegates. I mean, I don't know what the rules of the Republican Party are, but I suspect that there are delegates from some states, maybe all states, who are not legally obliged to vote for the person.
Really, the first ballot, because what we typically hear in the media is the first ballot has a rock-solid commitment for the Democrats to vote, for the delegates to vote for the candidate who they ran for.
That may be, but I'm not entirely certain about that, but I've read that as well. But I think the deals can be done, if I'm not mistaken. But I think what really gets interesting, as you suggest, is if it's just shy of the number he needs. Then you go into the smoke-filled room, and then you get people cutting deals.
Speaking of Donald Trump and cutting deals, stay there, because we're going to bring on some additional interesting evidence. Time for evidence-based politics, where we pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Voters in the Donald Trump camp cite many reasons for supporting him, among them his ability to get things done, to make deals. His wealth is proof. But to what extent is Trump the great business person he claims to be? And how wealthy is he? We asked Greg David to research this for us. A regular at this table, Greg is director of the Business and Economics Reporting Program at the City University of New York's Graduate School of Journalism. Longtime editor of Crain's New York Business. He is now a columnist there and a prolific blogger. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Brian.
So you first learned not to necessarily to trust statistics about Trump's wealth a long time ago, right?
That's right. February 1990, and the news breaks that Trump and Ivana are getting a divorce. This was like the biggest story in New York, if everyone remembers. The gossip columnists were on the 5 o'clock news, driving up ratings. The tabloids were selling more copies than they'd sold in a long time. And Geraldo Rivera invites me on this show to talk about it with like 10 other people. I remember Joyce Brothers was there, and Raul Felder, the great divorce attorney, and I'm there to say whether he can afford the $20 million he would have to pay in a divorce. So I do some research. Forbes says his net worth is $1.7 billion. The Times says $3 billion. And I talk to a couple people, and I go on the show, and I say, of course he could pay the $20 million. So I'm walking out of the studio with Felder, who looks at me and says, you know a lot more about this than I do, but this doesn't feel right to me. I don't think he's got the money. And a few weeks later, we found out he didn't have the money. He was in desperate shape. Now, I know how these things work, and I know Trump himself had a role in all those estimates, and I've always regarded it as a great lesson, one in journalistic humility, and particularly when it comes to Trump.
How did the truth come out in that case?
Oh, well, pretty soon that, his financial strains were becoming clear. The bankers, I think, started to talk about it. Forbes actually then broke a very long story that he didn't have the cash he said he did. I assume some of the bankers called up Forbes, or Forbes got to the bankers who said, this is a house of cards.
So this is a question that people are speculating about today because Trump won't release his tax returns. Does that make him unique among the candidates?
Well, I think maybe not at this point in the campaign, but pretty soon it will make him unique because for many election cycles, people have released their tax returns. Now, what he did is he filed 2 statements with the Federal Elections Commission. The first said he had income of $362 million in 2014, and he said his net worth was $8.7 billion, though he's since raised it to about $10 billion. Well, some people have looked at the $360 million income, and they think it's not income the way you and I would report it on our income tax. It's the way a company does. It's like total revenue, after which there are lots of expenses. So maybe his income is nowhere near that. As for the net worth figure, Trump says his brand is worth $4 billion. Now, I don't really know exactly what he means by that. But the normal way you would value a brand is what you could sell it for. But who's he going to sell it to? So is this a real figure? For the moment, I would say we should be skeptical.
He couldn't sell it because nobody else could claim to be Trump.
Right. And I guess somebody would assume that he'd live for the next 10 years and generate so much money they'd get their $4 billion back.
Can we break down a little bit what we know he owns, like office buildings, for example?
He owns 4 or 5 office buildings in New York. Trump Tower is the most well-known, 40 Wall Street. He's got 3 incredibly expensive homes, one in Florida, one here, one on Beverly Hills. He does own 13 golf courses. But most of the places that you see that have the Trump name, he does not own. He's licensing his name. In some cases, he's involved in the management. In some cases, he's involved in the design. But in many cases, he's just saying, go use my name. There were all these lawsuits after the financial crisis in Florida for all these condos along the beach that were Trump that lost all their value. And in those lawsuits, Trump said, I'm not responsible. I just sold my name.
How about the bankruptcies along the way? He makes no bones about this when he's asked about it on the campaign trail, that yes, he's used the bankruptcy laws that are there for a reason, and he's used them. Has he been technically bankrupt a number of times?
He has not been bankrupt. But 4 of his companies, 4 casinos in New Jersey, have filed for bankruptcy. And I saw a great CNN story, CNN Money story, which looked at this, which said that they can find no one who's been associated with a company in the last 30 years that's filed 4 times. So I guess he's the king of bankruptcy, too.
But bankruptcy, in a legal sense, doesn't mean you've got no money left. It means you're filing for this legal protection while you restructure a business.
That's true. That's exactly what it means. And in many cases, and Trump has forced investors and employees and everyone else to take big losses in these bankruptcies.
So if he's the only candidate who doesn't appear to be getting ready to release his tax returns, based on your knowledge of his finances, what do you think he's trying to hide?
Well, I don't know, of course, because none of us know, but I have 2 speculations. The first one of which is he's not worth anything near where he says. And as a matter of fact, I'm pretty confident he's definitely not worth $10 billion. The $4 billion brand value is ridiculous. The second possibility is he doesn't pay any taxes. Now, I'm not saying illegally, but legally, that his finances are arranged in such a way that he doesn't pay much. And, the fact that Mitt Romney paid only 13.7% was a big deal last time. What if he pays 5%?
Terry Galway, any historical analogies as a historian that you could think of?
The last person I can think of who ran for and succeeded in winning a nomination based just on business experiences, Wendell Willkie in 1940. Had never held an elective office before, but Willkie was not somebody who went around the country saying how wealthy he was. He actually engaged Franklin Roosevelt in a debate at a very critical time in American history. So Ross Perot, of course, ran a third-party candidacy based in part on the fact that he could self-finance. But again, the level of dialogue. Ross Perot is nothing like Trump.
There is the mayor of New York, the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, who went right into that chief executive of government position from having been CEO of his company, didn't work his way up through commissioner positions or city council or anything like that. And by many people's lights, he was a very good mayor. Is he a model we can look at for?
I think Michael Bloomberg.
And he's very
if
opposed
Michael
to Donald.
Bloomberg is watching this, he is cringing at you.
He's very opposed to Donald Trump, for the record.
I think we would say that also he took to the issues of governing. He liked to govern. He liked to run things, and he liked to run a government too. And my thinking is that is an open question with Donald Trump.
Yeah. So deal making. He promotes himself as a deal maker and says, therefore, I'll be able to transfer that skill to our polarized government, our gridlocked government. Is there any evidence for that in history, one way or another?
Well, there's certainly evidence for deal making. I mean, that's how our Constitution was made, with a deal. But the question is, Donald Trump has never had to deal with the sorts of people who are in politics on Capitol Hill. He's dealt with other businessmen. He's dealt with them as equals, I suppose. But I don't see how he can tell us that he can then translate these traits to politics.
Greg, as a New Yorker, in 30 seconds, New York values, as Ted Cruz liked to say, certainly include friendliness toward immigration, friendliness towards diversity, things like that. Trump and Cruz are running kind of the opposite of that. On the other hand, Trump is a New Yorker and represents this other side of New York values. Does he run away with this New York primary?
Yes, because the Republican voters in New York are not the mythic Republican liberals of Jacob Javits and Nelson Rockefeller. 55% of them are outside downstate, including the suburbs. 82% of them hate Hillary Clinton. 72% say the country's going in the wrong direction. And by the way, outside of New York City, they don't make much money. They are very typical Trump voters. All polls all show him trumping his opponents here in New York. He looks very strong in New York.
Greg David, Terry Galway, thank you both very much. New York primary coming up in a few weeks on April 19th, after Wisconsin and a few others. And that's POTUS 2016 for today. We're here each week at this hour calling the presidential horse race and pouring cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Next week, caucus results from Hawaii, Alaska, and Washington State. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.